Well, hi again, everybody. It's Traci Smith. I'm here again for another conversation on atonement, theology, and kids. Super excited to have Danielle Shroyer with us. She is the author of the book Original Blessing, which if you haven't read it, I really encourage you to read it. If you're like me and several people that have talked to you about this book in the past couple of weeks, and you say, I have it on my shelf, I've looked at it, I haven't read it cover to cover, please do so. You will not regret it. It's one of the most meaningful theology books I've read in a long time. I was like you, I had kind of skimmed through it, and then I recently just read it cover to cover. And like I told you, Danielle, before we started recording, I have tons of actual hearts in the margins. Like, love this, or this is so beautiful. I think if you read this book and you're a pastor, you'll find a month's worth of things to drop into your sermons. So as you might, I think, Danielle, I'm doing a series of talks on atonement specifically, and I've been reviewing just for new, if that language is not a part of your daily life, and it probably is not for a lot of people. Atonement is, what does the death of Jesus on the cross mean? What does it mean? Most people will say something like, well, Jesus died for my sins. And that's what we tell kids, right? Because we try to make it easy, but that's kind of a big, heavy statement. What does it really mean? Is it transactional? Is the actual blood doing something? And your book talks about taking that question and going all the way back to the beginning of it, which is, what is our nature as people? Are we naturally prone to sin? Do we have like a sin, fingerprint that makes us have to have the cross? So I thought I would start by just asking, and I am curious about this. I don't know the answer to this. Curious about your own faith background as a kid. What did you think about this? What did you think about Jesus and sin and the whole thing when you were little?
Yeah. We were like occasional churchgoers. So I wasn't the kid that was in the pews every Sunday and didn't end up having to deconstruct my faith because we didn't go enough. And I'm like, thanks, Mom and Dad. That's great. I appreciate you going more to the Baptist church. But my earliest memory actually is that I remember being sad about Jesus dying. And I remember that everyone tried to talk me out of it. Like, don't be sad. It's such a good thing. And I was like, very side eye. I was like, listen, I am only 7 or whatever, but like whatever happened to that guy is like not cool at all.
It's not good.
I love Jesus. Yeah, you've done all these things to make me love him. And now I have this deep like connection and compassion and love for this person. And then I find out that he died in this way. And I'm so sad about what happened. And so my earliest memory is just about my feeling of just like, I was so convicted that it was so awful what happened to Jesus.
Yeah.
And people just did not feel comfortable with how like upset it made me. So yeah, I think that was honestly a question that I held for so long. And I mean, I do feel like it sort of hit this culminating point in seminary where I was like, I have got to figure out what I think about the cross, or else like I shouldn't be here, Yeah. But yeah, when I really think back, I that started when I was young, because I think kids have such a deep emotional, of course they're sad. This is why Disney movies are designed the way that they are, and Pixar movies, right? They know that there's that big threat is something that deeply moves children. So.
Yes. I mean, I think whenever I talk about this conversation, at some point it gets to this where, hello, Marina, daughter just walked in, where we say, okay, it's intuitive. It's so intuitive. Kids understand it. Hello. Can you please?
Good morning.
Daddy?
Alexa said there's a reminder, and he said the party started.
Oh, yes. Alexa does give us lots of reminders. Go find Daddy. Yes, please. Remember that part where I said, can you keep the kids away from it? It's like, you have to kind of override what is in your intuition. And I know that Tony Jones was he the editor of this book?
Yeah, well, acquisitions editor.
Acquisitions
Lisa
editor, okay.
Kloskin was the editor, yeah.
So in his book about did God kill Jesus, I remember there's this line that's basically like, it doesn't pass. I think he said like the sniff test or the smell test. Like,
right, yes.
The smell test. If you back up and say, does it make sense that a loving God or any kind of God,
yeah,
what kind of God would it be to be like, okay, I created these people, they through their own choice, now they're terrible. I can't do anything about it except kill my own perfect child on a cross. Like that doesn't smell right. It's like a lot of convoluted, it doesn't really make sense. And kids haven't been taught to like override all of those things. So they're like, no, it doesn't, it's sad and tragic. And so that's my passion around this whole conversation is with children, because I work with children's ministry leaders in the main line, in the Baptist church, in progressive churches, and lots of stories of kids being sad and traumatized by the story, right? So, don't want to go to church because I heard that Jesus died for my sins. So I wanted to tell a story that's similar to your story. So if you haven't read, do you want to tell the story about the priest in the elevator?
Oh, sure.
All right.
Yeah, I was at a conference, and this priest was with us. It was a bunch of, ministers and whatever. And we had spent all this time having a great conversation at the bar or whatever. And then we were all like, okay, good night. So the priest and I get in the elevator to go to our rooms. And he was like, so yeah, you're writing a book. What are you writing a book about? And I was like, oh, I'm writing a book about original blessing. And he was like, what's that? And I was like, oh, it's like the idea that we were born good, that we don't have a sin nature. And he was like, you don't really live in original sin? And I was like, no, I
Evidently no.
Nope, writing a whole book about it. And he said, well, then what's the point of Jesus?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's so depressing after having this great, deep, like thoughtful, meaty conversation of theology for like 3 hours with this group of people, including him. And then it just all came down to this very flimsy, at least this is my approach, of course, but I thought, how can you have thought about Jesus so extensively?
Yeah.
And think it's just about like a blood transfusion at the end of the day.
This transactional, the day that it's that one day, that's what it's about. I mean, I have my own thoughts about how it ended up that way and how it continues to be that way, which is a whole other sidetrack. But I think I remember in your book, you sort of set up that story. And then towards the end, when you're talking about like, okay, well, how should we understand Christ on the cross? Which for those of you that are here because you want to talk about that aspect of it, it's like the final third of your book. You sort of have this, it's not snarky, but it's a very straightforward, like, well, buddy, if you don't know what Jesus is about apart from this, then maybe just read the Gospels again. Right. But my kind of version of that comes from a conference where I was speaking about faith in children. And I'm speaking about a lot of things, like, my whole deal, faith practice and blah, blah, blah. And I kind of dropped in there like, well, when you're teaching your faith to your kids, what are the things you want to teach them? And what are the things that you don't want to pass on? So I just dropped in, just like, it was, slides. I had like 2 slides about this, saying like this atonement thing, blah, blah, blah. I don't want that. I want them to love Jesus his whole life and to put his death in the proper context and not believe that, everything we just said. And after the presentation, there was, a line of people for Q&A, and everybody, that's what they wanted to talk about. And it was it was a version of that. This was at a conference that most of the attendees were out of a very sort of fundamentalist background, I would say. And to a person, that was the question. Like, I love what you're saying. I never bought this as a kid, but I thought that my only other option was to just no faith at home, right? Like no faith, no church. I didn't even know, like people were just wide-eyed. Like, are there churches that would be on board with this crazy thing that you're talking about, right? And so it was out of that I thought, oh, this is something I want to talk about more with my readers. I want to talk about it more in conversations like this because there's something to it. I had a question about your background that I was curious about because it comes up a lot in your book. Is there anybody in your family that is Eastern Orthodox, or
No.
so you talk a lot about Eastern Orthodox, Armenian Orthodox, and then you have a Lebanese grandmother. What's
Yes.
the background? Does she have a background?
Yeah, so actually my family is Druze,
Okay.
which you probably haven't even heard of. It's a very, very tiny ancient sect that's like a multiple offshoot of Islam. So it's not Muslim at all, but it's actually, well, does it predate? It's confusing. Anyway, we're old, okay? We're old. And it's passed on kind of in a similar way to Judaism. It is cultural and ethnic and religious. So technically I'm not Druze anymore because I didn't marry a Druze.
Okay.
Mom didn't marry a Druze. So actually my mom is technically Druze and I'm not because she broke the line, right? So that is that's my background, which is very complicated.
Sure.
But what it means, I think, is that I grew up understanding that my grandparents, who were deeply Druze and went to the conferences, and I remember having conversations with my grandfather about Khalil Gibran, right? And he was deeply philosophical and all these things. And then it was very different than what I heard at school, which was Episcopalian, and at church, which was Baptist, And so I think what that did help me do that faith was realize that because I didn't get just one message, it helped me acknowledge really early on that God was bigger than just one denomination, which, what a gift, honestly,
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think for me in this journey, I've come to the same sort of, warmth toward Eastern Orthodox siblings and wanting to see, okay, this is where I can learn. And as you say in your book, Christianity for 400 years didn't have this. If we go back to the beginning, right? But I think for me as a Presbyterian, so you're doing a residency in a Presbyterian church right now. So I thought, we can at least talk about this. As Presbyterians, I mean, we're very much on the original sin train, right? Yeah. So Calvin, I went to Calvin College, right? It's very, very deeply rooted in there. So to in some ways to preach this in a Presbyterian church, I think still, even now in 2022, comes across as like radical.
Yes.
And I don't want to make light of it because my church is fairly liberal politically, theologically. They're not tied to this in some sort of specific way, but I do think it's the story that they've been told, right? When I say well, it's not Jesus dying on the cross for your sins, I don't really believe. They're like, well, what do you mean? Like, what else could it be? Like, it doesn't make any sense. The hymnology, is it hymnology? Hymnody?
Yes, hymnology.
Washed in the blood, the creeds, the words of institution at communion. You're supposed to say, every time you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the saving death of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. And I've always added, you proclaim the saving life, death, and resurrection. Just that tiny change. I feel like month after month kind of brings it back. But so let me think about where I wanted to go with all this. So I guess the place to start with original blessing is where everybody starts with original sin, which is Genesis 3. I love the title of your chapter, which I guess I'll be, spoiler alert, is along the lines of everybody simmer down about Genesis 3. Everybody calm down.
Deep breath.
Take a deep breath. Let's all take a deep breath. The thing that you say in there that I thought, I'm going to apply this to all of my Bible studies, or try to remember to say this. You have a good long portion about not making demands of Scripture, letting Scripture speak on its own terms. But for those who haven't read the book, or those who read it a long time ago, what's your kind of short answer to original sin? Sorry, some people will be like, sorry, I don't like it. Sorry, it's uncomfortable, but it is right there in the Scriptures, and they'll point directly to Genesis 3. If you only have an elevator ride to talk me out of it, what are you going to say?
Yeah. Well, I would say, show me, like, where is it?
Yeah.
Tell me where it says in a verse that God was like, oh, I made them good, but then because of this decision, I decided that they're not good anymore. Like, it isn't in there. Show me the word fall. It isn't in there. Like, it's just not there. We assume so much that it is, and it isn't. And so I talk instead about it being a growing up story, and that it's inevitable. Like, sin is not like a fate. It's an inevitability in the sense that, like, we're human. We're not going to get everything right. And actually, maybe that's sort of part of the whole thing. You know, maybe the way of wisdom is that it requires us to make decisions, some of which we get right, some of which we don't get right, and that those work together to build wisdom in us in a way that God has actually intended this whole thing to be. Right. So it's not in there.
It's not
just isn't
in there. And I have a little devil's advocate question about that, but I'll put that a pin in it for a second, because I was realizing as you're talking, I wanted to make my husband is Colombian. We speak Spanish at home, and he always says la precisión, like the precision. Like, I want to clarify the precision. I'm trying to think of how you say that in English. The precision of original sin is even important, right? So you're saying, you said something like, well, when I asked all my people just in the preparation for this book, like, well, what do you think original sin is? A lot of people simply said that everybody sins. And you're arguing that point. That is in scripture. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. I just, 1 John 1, if we claim that we're without sin, we deceive ourselves and the truth is not in us. You're not saying that there's no such thing as sin, right?
No.
It's not that. And I think I remember you saying something like, if that was the point, nobody would need to write a book about that. It's very obvious. You just search your own heart and know that there is such a thing as sin. The issue of original sin is it part of our nature? Is it like in our DNA, we have this nature that we're always going to go towards sin? And I think the Calvin part is the total depravity. Like, we're totally depraved in our nature. And I think the critique of saying that that's not true is, I think people want to kind of say, well, it's like these liberal, mamby-pamby, soft, snowflakey moms, in my case, moms, who don't want to expose their children to the harsh truth and the ways of the world, that this is how it is. Also, with regard to the death of Jesus, like, sorry you don't like it, but it's in there. The guy was beaten and tortured. It's like, we're not arguing that point.
Right. Yeah.
We know that happened. It's the meaning behind it. So how would you respond? I guess, okay, so I'll just ask you my devil's advocate question, because another word that's not in the Bible is Trinity.
Trinity. Yeah.
So do people say, well, that's not in there? Do you believe in that too? Like, what?
Well, I always say, honestly, like, I do, because I think some implications are there. But if you don't want me to use the word Trinity, because it's not like that, I don't mind. Like, that doesn't stress me out. You know what I mean?
Yes.
I'm like, I think God is in relational something with part of God's self. Like, I think that seems fairly evident, and Jesus seems pretty evident, and the Spirit seems pretty evident. But, sure, cool. We should hold that lightly also, There's far more evidence that you could write about why people have come up with the idea of a Trinity than you can when you start getting into these places where people are like, but the fall, it's like, no. I mean, and you named two of the main verses, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Exactly.
True.
That's why the subtitle of the book is Putting Sin in Its Rightful Place. It's not saying, rocketing sin into the atmosphere so that we never have to think about it again. We're just putting sin in its rightful place, which is when original sin says that we're inclined to evil continually, meaning not only that we have this thing in our DNA that like wants to sin, but that we want to sin first. It's our first inclination. That, I think, is the main thing that's helpful for people to understand why it's such a problem. It's not that we have, like, if it said all these, if it, meaning like every doctrine that the church denominations have, right? Because almost all of them use that phrase, inclined to evil continually. Some of them add more and some of them add less, but at least they say that. And if they also said, we're inclined to good continually and we're inclined to evil continually, I would not argue. I'd be like, fair. There's always a battle going on, right?
Yes.
Because we ingested the knowledge of both good and evil, and those things are always being held in a healthy tension within us. Which again, I think is because God had this crazy plan about wisdom that said, you have to have this tension for the wisdom to come, right? I wouldn't argue about that. I do argue about inclined to evil continually only, as if like we're always going to want to pick the bad thing first, you know? So that's the distinction. And then now I totally just lost what your question was. Did I answer it all?
Sure, because I'm not able to unravel it either.
Okay. Oh, I think we were talking about the Trinity, but yeah.
I was using that as a launching off point, and I think we're the same. Go.
Yeah. No, I remember. The other thing I was going to say is like, I get that all the time too. People being like, oh, well, isn't that nice? Of course, I would love to just be able to have the naivete to believe in something like original blessing. And I mean, the funny thing about that, and I do try to cover it in the book, is that actually it makes you take sin so much more seriously.
Yes.
And if they're like, when people have said, oh, but like, look at what happened to Jesus. He died. Like it was brutal, you know? And I'm like, yeah. And you're trying to gloss over it by saying that none of that I should feel as a kid is sad because he died for my sins and I got something out of it. Right. Like that's what's messed up, you know? And I'm actually not supposed to think that it's sad as it is. Right. And so I think that there are these ways where we can really make light of sin, or at least feel this escapist, like, since it's inevitable, I don't have to think about it. Whereas if you think about original blessing, you have to become so much more responsible, because you can't say it's not your fault. And you can't say that that person's sin is not your responsibility either, because my God, we're all connected.
Yes.
So like, I didn't spill oil in the ocean, but I have to figure out, because, you know, it's my ocean too, right? So I have to figure that out, even though I wasn't on the Exxon Valdez or whatever. Like it doesn't, that's actually beside the point.
Yep.
You know?
Yes. And the point that, you know, you repeat, I wanted to say you make it, but you're sharing it from other traditions and from others is, you know, when we talk about the repair from sin, you know, it's not just about asking God for forgiveness, it's about going to the people that wounded and asking them for forgiveness. And I think that's something else that's sort of lost, especially in the Reformed tradition. And for good reason. I do toe my party Presbyterian line that, look, we don't need a mediator. We can go directly to Jesus, we can go directly to God anytime we want to. We don't need somebody in between us. We can do that. But we do maybe, I don't know, let ourselves off the hook a little bit on some of this way repair, you know, for others. I guess out of my own curiosity, you've studied this a lot, and I wonder, so I'm so, you know, sort of steeped in Calvin because of my college background. Before that, not so much. But if you give an image in your book about your grandmother make a mistake on a blanket that she's knitting, like way back, and she says, well, the only way to fix it, you have to unravel it, get to the mistake, and then re-ravel it. And this is, I feel a little embarrassed asking this because I should know. I went to the same seminary as you, I think. But when you're unraveling the doctrine of original sin, Luther and Calvin that started this whole thing?
No, it's Augustine. You got to go.
You gotta go all the way back.
Further back. Yeah. It's really 4th century, because that's when it's really when East and West split, and the West started continually making decisions. And I kind of talk about it in the book as these 2 boxes of sin and death. And I think when we started thinking that sin was its own big box and that death went inside of it, meaning that like everything's about sin, then I think, to me, that's where we started to really get our priorities like out of whack, because there's no way to say as we're reading scripture, and then, you know, our kids are, if they're not already, they're going to be teenagers, are going to start reading this stuff on their own. They're going to be like, well, Mom, it says, like, you know, he's the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. So what does that mean? Right? There is some of this language in there, and I don't want to undo that either. Again, it's about putting sin in its rightful place. So when you acknowledge that sin is an indicator of death, then that's the way, again, to kind of bring it back and say, switches from me being so confused when I was like 10 or 11 to be like, well, I didn't ask Jesus to die for me, like what sins is he dying for? Like, I think the worst thing I did is I like stayed up late reading my Nancy Drew. I just don't think Jesus should have died to die for that.
Right.
But then if someone had said to me like, no, it's because of all the stuff that we do that disconnects us from love and from God and from life, and that like that hurts all of us. I think even a 10-year-old would be like, yes, because when my friends didn't invite me to the birthday party, that hurt me and that hurts, whatever. And like, do you know what I mean? Like there's just these really simple ways to make that understandable for people, because it's about love and life and the big things. And that feels so much more connecting than this idea of like, you did bad, so Jesus had to like rip his wrist open for you. And you're like, what? Why?
Yes. And I think it does cheapen it in some ways. I mean, this is like big, obviously kind of perspective is around children, but we have talked about this in the other conversations. So sorry guys, I'm talking about it again, but like those little resurrection eggs, have you seen those?
Yes.
Telling the story, you're opening it up, it's like, here guys is a tiny whip, here is a tiny crown of thorns, and you're like, what? And this is one day, and this is a sad day, and it did happen, and we should talk about it. One of the things Laura said, I haven't decided in which order I'm posting these, so one of the things that you will hear or did hear Laura say about this is that by the time you get to the day of Good Friday, if you're trying to talk about it then, you're kind of too late, because there's this whole story before, this whole thing after that. If you're scrambling to like talk about this entire theology on this day, it's kind of messed up. And I guess for me, I would be happy if people would, first of all, know, and second of all, present the fact that there's more than one view historically and even now on what this means, and that everybody belongs. Everybody is, you don't lose your Christian card, right? I think a lot of people, even in the mainland, would be like, if you don't believe that Jesus's blood makes you clean, then you're not a Christian. That is the thing. That is what it's all about. And I think I would say, I would agree that the resurrection is what it's all about. That the story is what it's all about, but it's not what we think. And I don't know what you think. I'm curious to know if you think that this is the intent. I'm gonna have to go back and read Augustine, whatever. I don't know. I guess I always blamed Calvin because I get so mad at him he just goes on and on and on about this. Like,
yeah, he does. I mean,
yeah,
I don't want to totally let them, either of those guys, off the hook. I mean, it's for sure a lot of this is their fault, that they really doubled down on it. But they couldn't have done that if Augustine hadn't made sin the primary problem and made individual sin a problem, which, to be honest, this is a whole other conversation, but like, philosophically speaking, like the idea of the individual self was partly Augustine's issue too, which like, thank you. And also yikes, because I don't know if we understand. I mean, I come from a deeply clan focused ancestors, right? And I don't know if I will ever be able to understand how they saw the world, because I'm a Western American, yes. And so much had to be untethered for Luther and Calvin to do what they did, right? But
like teed it up.
Teed it up, and it was almost inevitable, right? Because like when you start siloing sin into these individual things, then like, and he did it, he added shame into it too, right? Like a lot of this was just because, boy, he he wasn't able to freely be who he was, right?
Right.
And certainly had a mother complex and just some other things he probably needed a therapist for, and bless his heart that he didn't have one. And so, yeah, that kind of like led us to this place where like, of course, we're going to end up feeling individually shamed for what happened to Jesus on the cross. Like, that's not just something that happened in a Baptist 1980s Baptist youth camp. Like, this started all the way back there,
Right.
but it's so sad because to me, and this is what I think is really important about us reclaiming this for kids, is that to me, because I see it all through this wisdom lens, like if there's a way for us to reclaim that wisdom lens in the way that we talk about sin and death and the cross and all these things, then there's so much rich, like connecting points that kids understand about things like Jesus was scared. Like, what a beautiful thing to be able to tell your kids. Like, even if it's they're scared before the volleyball tryouts or their science project presentation, it's like, you know what? Yeah, Jesus also was scared and thought, is there a way I can get out of this? Like, this is such a human thing. It's no big deal, you know? Or Jesus knows what it feels like to be betrayed. Jesus understands what it means to suffer. Like, all of these things make us feel, again, it encourages that connection with him instead of telling us that we don't get to feel the deep things about Jesus.
Yes.
You know? And then I think the other thing that's really helpful, I was just reading the other day a book by this Buddhist teacher, Dilgo Khyentse, and he mentioned this phrase, wisdom fear. And I thought, oh my gosh, like I wrote on a sticky note. I was like, wisdom fear, like that's so good. But he was like, listen, like there's these different kinds of fears that you have to be aware of that are going on all the time in your body. And some of them are just, it's just noise and anxiety. And some of it is about stuff that you can't control and you need to let go of that. But sometimes it's a wisdom fear, realizing like, this is genuinely something that can be hard for me or can hurt me or like that I need to be aware of. And only when you acknowledge that can you move forward in a way that feels, I mean, you can't get out of what might be coming, but you can at least at that point choose to be awake to it in a way that is like wise living. And to me, when I saw that phrase wisdom fear, I thought, oh my word, this is what Jesus does so well for us. And this is what I think as a young person, I needed him to embody for me is like, well, what do you do when you have to walk into something where you think you might get crucified for it, metaphorically, right? He set his face towards Jerusalem and he had a wisdom fear. Like he didn't say, it's going to be cool when I go in there. They're going to throw me a party. Like he was fully sure about what was, you know what I mean? But like, you think about all the things these young people these days are going to have to face about, you know, whatever, you'd be all sad about white supremacy and fascism and climate change and things that they're going to have wisdom fear about and like set their face towards the place of power and say, I have to go say something true and good about this. Where does that courage come from? It has to come from acknowledging that and then saying like, can I trust that love is bigger than death, that life is bigger than death? Even as I walk towards this thing that is for sure not guaranteeing that I'm going to be okay.
Yeah.
Right. And so like, to me, my God, that's what young people today need more than anything. And Jesus's whole story just so beautifully says, honey, it's going to be so hard, but you do have that courage in you right now. Like you have it.
Yes.
You know?
Again, who was the author that said that? The wisdom fear?
Yeah, his name is Dilgo Khyentse. Oh, let me see. Oh, here it is. Look how cute he is.
Oh my gosh. Okay. The Heart of Compassion. Sounds like you recommend the book.
I just started it because anyway, I'm doing this whole 37 verses of the Bodhisattva and he wrote a commentary on it.
Oh my gosh. What are you doing that as a personal study or with your people?
I am doing that on my little Soul Ninja blog where I'm always like practicing a little Buddhist something. And so I'm starting that like next week, but he dropped that little wisdom fear thing in the intro. So I was like, listen, this is going to be good. Hope you don't mind. I'm going to use it for Jesus.
I mean, yeah, I've been talking about that with a lot of people recently too, like truth where we find it, right? You know, like,
yes,
truth where we find it. What do we have to offer? What can someone from another faith hear from Jesus and be like, yes, like same, I feel that, I know that. Yes. As you're talking, and maybe it's because I was already thinking about where was the next question I wanted to ask. And so then I saw what you were saying through that lens, but I was thinking about, so the next kind of piece or question I have is like, well, how practically, okay, if we're on board, I think a lot of people listening will be like, oh yeah, yes, I get it. I know that, I think that, I've been studying it, or I'm open to it, but I don't know, first of all, how to go about teaching and getting it to my people? And two, what are the costs? What is it going to cost me? And I think, talking about the courage that it takes, I don't want to gloss over that. I think sometimes I can be a little snarky about it, like, oh, it's the right thing to do and blah, blah, blah. I think it's in some ways kind of easy for me to say in a church, number one, that's, like I said, kind of open to theological inquiry and intellectual exercise. Number two, I have other work that I do with writing and speaking. So I don't feel necessarily like, oh no, if something were to really go up in flames, which I don't think it would, but if it were, like, I think it'll be okay. I don't think I need, I think there are many that are in denominations and structures where this is actually incredibly dangerous, not to sound overblown about it.
Yeah.
There's a lot at stake. So how do we help people move the needle, and how do we help them through all of this with integrity too, because their jobs and paychecks depend on kind of preaching the party line.
Yeah. And I don't know if I have a great example or answer to that, except to say, when I was writing this book, actually, I was like, how many trolls are going to come at, like, how many 5-point Calvinists are going to send me hate mail for this? And so I wrote this little note and put it sort of right out where I could see it every day that said, like, you don't have to argue. You just have to say what's true. Because it helped me. I like to argue. Like, I don't mind getting in a brawl, I actually, I find that delightful. Like, I think that's a great way to spend the day. And so it's no big deal for me if I do that, but I didn't. The thing about it is that I just think it's true, right? Clearly I could be wrong. But it would be moving mountains to get me to change my mind about it. Yeah. I just think that the story of God is about life triumphing over death. I think that's the whole story. I think the whole story from beginning to end is about God having a love that's so faithful that we can literally kill his son and he still forgives us for it. That's what I think it's about. I think it's like, hi, you think that you can lose this? You literally can't. There's what worse thing could you do than that I send you my most precious, wonderful, beloved son, and like, oh, because of political whatever and all this, like, and I give you Easter, do you know? So like, what are you scared of? So I think the whole thing is about courage. I think the whole thing is about learning how to set our face towards what's hard. And to have the courage to walk towards even suffering, not that we seek it, but that we know that sometimes it seeks us, but that we are so convicted to be people who stand in what feels beautiful and true, that we're willing to do that work. And that work, we trust, connects us to everyone else and to God, even when people are trying so hard to rip that apart. And so I'm kind of rambling, but I would say it is so hard when your paycheck is based on substitutionary atonement and you towing the line. And I think some of that is just about getting to that place in your heart where you get really close to your own calling and say, what kind of Christians do I want to disciple and grow, and what did I feel called to proclaim? Like, I remember when we got our degrees, I don't know if you were told the same thing, but like when the president handed me the thing, he said, may every thought be held captive to Christ. And like, for whatever reason, I don't know if it's a little ritual or what, but I was like, oh my God, that's a vow. Like, I have to take this piece of paper and try to do that, I
love that.
And so like, if I'm going to have every thought be captive to Christ, that doesn't mean that I tell people to feel bad about what Jesus did on the cross or to whatever. It means that I'm trying to teach them to have wisdom fear. Yes. And to teach them to have courage despite the wisdom fear, and to do what's right, and to live for love, and to make the big choices. And I don't in any way want to be like, and that means you should quit your job or get fired. I just mean, like, I think that helps us know how to be And sometimes when we stand in that, people receive it differently than we think. And I think when we come in being argumentative or trying to like change the whole system and, you know, come with a more, I think that's a disconnecting way of being. And I think if we just stay in that place where we're like, how can I help, instead of how can I disconnect people from this thing, instead considering it, how can I connect people to the way that I see Jesus working, or I see the cross? I feel like that won't be quite as destructive. And I don't know if it'll keep people's jobs in place, but I think if they lose it, they will leave with their head held high, right?
Yes.
Like, you know, don't throw a bomb in the sanctuary, right? Like, don't do that. There's no need. It's true. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah, I think, and I don't necessarily have an answer. I mean, I have some thoughts about it as well. I guess my reason for bringing it up is that I don't want to minimize how tightly people hold to this, I guess. And and when you said, you know, when you published the book, you're wondering like how many trolls are going to come out. What's the answer to that? Like how many people ignore it?
Listen, they don't care. It's so great. I don't think the Gospel Coalition even knows my name. Fine by me, right? I'm not that big a deal, which is its own grace, I think. No, truly, like, I mean, it didn't hop to the New York Times bestseller and, you know, Krista Tippett didn't call. It may have been different if that had all happened.
Yeah.
But I mean, that was such a huge prayer for me the whole time, as I was like, God, I need the medium to be the message, to be like how I am as I write this has to be what I'm saying. You know what I mean? And I just need to be very clear that I did not do that entirely, obviously. But I will say I tried, right? Like my intention, despite certainly, of course, because I'll have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, I didn't. But my hope was that this would be something that people would receive as loving and and also that I didn't have to prove that it's true, because it just is true. It just is true, right? So I kind of feel like the same thing is about the atonement conversation. Like when I feel people getting their hackles up, I'm always like, I want you to tell me what you love about Jesus. What is it that you love about Jesus? And do you know what? In the however many years that I've been having these conversations with people, as I've been thinking about this book and writing this book and talking about this book and, you know, whatever, not one person has been like, I love that he bled for me on the cross. Nobody says that. Everybody says it's the Good Samaritan story. That's the one. What's your favorite? I love that he always was so sweet to children. I love the way that he always had his eye on the outcast. Nobody ever says he poured his blood out for me. Like nobody says that. And so if you can get people to understand that they're not following him for that, and that maybe it's a big old mystery, and that we won't understand it because we don't understand communal things in the same way, and we don't understand rituals that they have in the same way. Like I've looked it up. None of that makes any sense to me. Right. So whatever symbol he was pulling on we're too many cultures away to entirely totally get what he's trying to say. Exactly. Hi.
Hello again. Can you say hi to Danielle? Yes. Okay, very nice. I'm gonna almost finish with my talk. Okay, can you go tell Daddy that you were in here, please? Locked the door. But then if I lock the door, there's like
knocking. It's the knocking. Yes. I love
room is over here. Sometimes I'm like, what is it? Yeah, I think it's so true. I think moving the needle a little tiny bit, right? Like just opening the door and seeing where the Spirit takes it. I mean, I guess that's another is like, where is the Spirit taking all of us and taking this? What's next? Is it part of a larger, I don't know, a larger thing that we don't have to control, you know, that it just kind of ride it. I love what you said about, you know, fearing people's response, and then it didn't happen. I think that, I've had a similar experience. I think that's another rabbit trail, but I think sometimes, I think the answer is, the reason it hasn't happened is that the reason the Gospel Coalition hasn't started harassing you is that they haven't found out about the book yet, right? Or like maybe they'll be like, But maybe now it's like yawn.
Yeah.
What that like we're used to them. We disown them. We kick them out of the family. They're not, I think it's about making sure that other people know. Like I'm starting to get a little bit of heat because some of my stuff has crossed over into the work. And so now the message is like, people are like, Traci Smith is a false teacher. Like once people get the message, like that's the box I put you in, then I think they'll just leave you alone happily.
Right.
I think it's about, I think the call, maybe at least my call right now, is to try and help people in the main line to get rid of this theology because it's still there and still pervasive. But I don't know. Sometimes I wonder if it's like too much of a soapbox, and if the Spirit's just going to do what she's going to do anyway, and I don't need to help her.
I think she encourages our help, but I also think she's got it. You know what I mean? Like this has just been in the works for so long. Like goodness, Matthew Fox wrote his original Blessing Tome that's like this big, it was like in the 80s, you know, and he was defrocked as a Catholic priest. Like he really had to pay the price for saying stuff that he was singing. And you know, and then of course before that, good night. It's been since the 4th century that people have held this story. I mean, just about original blessing. But the other thing I'll say too is that sometimes it's helpful if you're a pastor at a church where substitutionary atonement is the party line. If you just encourage people to expand beyond it, like, okay, let them hold it. Like, again, there is all that language in there that means ritual things that I don't understand about Babylonian, whatever. But can you just add that it's not only about that it's also about God being with the suffering, and it's also about love being stronger than death. And it's also about, do you know what I mean? Like if we just can broaden it and take the heat off it being that this is the whole freaking story and then you miss it. And then we're like traumatizing children. That's great. Like that's good and holy progress to just say, we can just expand this and let this be one of many things, you know, and that will also put it in its rightful place. Like, you know,
And you do that so well in the book. I think when you're talking about sin, talking about Genesis 3, like, hey, P.S., by the way, the first time the word sin comes up in the Bible isn't in this story, it's in this story. How many sermons have most of us preached on Cain and Abel's offerings and the murder, you know, of Cain killing Abel? I don't know if I've ever preached on it. But Genesis 3 definitely come up in a number of sermons. So that was an interesting challenge for me. I think maybe just in your sermon choices, what you choose to preach about. I think the first heart that I put in the margins of your book was at the very, very beginning when you said, and I can't remember if it was a friend or if it was a friend of a friend, where you said something about, once they learned that the whole story is about God's blessing, she went to her journal and just wrote like, I knew it. Yeah. And it almost brought me to tears, right? I think just thinking about, you know, when you're talking about Augustine 10 minutes ago, talking about, it was kind of like a throwaway, like the guy needed some help, but he didn't get it. But I think there's some truth there, right? And theology is now written on this. And it made me wonder, I think it's kind of a thread that's woven through your book. And you set it up at the very beginning. Is part of the reason that Jesus's blood has to mean something, just because we cannot handle that amount of love that God is giving to us. Like we have to make it, like we collectively, human beings, just to rest in that is incredibly hard. You know, I have a friend that like just a really talented and skilled person, and anytime I like make any like the lowest level compliment, is always comes back with some kind of snarky like I didn't deserve it, or whatever, like some kind of deflection,
this old thing,
right? Like and it's like from a person that's not trying to be falsely modest, it's genuine like reaction. I can't handle it. And it got to be this joke over time, like, you know, like I will compliment you and you will respond thank you, right? Like became this whole thing. But I think that's true of God's love, right? Like we can't handle that God would love us so much that God would forgive us for killing his son, that God would forgive us of anything, that there's no place that we could go. It's like, that can't be the plan. Like that can't, it's just so deeply unsettling. And I don't know if I've definitely thought about God's love being uncomfortable before, but I don't know if I've ever thought through, is that how we got to this place, that we changed the story such that, and I also think it's incredibly hard to accept that that death is senseless sometimes and tragic, right? That's what I want parents and Christian educators. That's when they ask me, like, well, what am I supposed to say? That Jesus died. It was very sad. How kind of how you started out, right?
It's so sad.
It was a very so
shouldn't have happened.
Sad. It was the darkest moment. It was so dark. And Laura talked about, like, you know, being in a church that, you know, they shook the walls and there's a, you know, a drum that, so that you can sit in it and feel sad. Like that. I actually don't think there's anything wrong with that. I don't like the one where it's like bells representing lashes and stuff like that. But like, you know, it's sad. Punto, as say, the end, right? Like,
yes.
So I think that's a place to start, right? To say, maybe to give, I don't know, I don't remember who it was, but somebody talks about like, well, preaching is about making a painting, like painting your art. And I feel that way about the resurrection. I'm definitely not going to go down that road today, but you know, the literal bodily resurrection of Jesus. I had a pastor, I will say this, I had a pastor growing up that said something like, if they found the bones of Jesus, like if somebody found the bones and they're like, these are Jesus's bones, and we can prove
proved it.
But pretend hypothetically they could, and they proved it. He was basically like, that would be the end for me. Like, I wouldn't be a pastor anymore. Like, that would be the end. Like, I can't, that's my belief in a bodily resurrection is so strong that I would leave the ministry. It would be the end. I'd pack it up. And I would say that my answer to that I would not have the same reaction. If they were like, these are the bones of Jesus, I would be like, well, resurrection is still true, right? The truth of resurrection does not depend on the bones of Jesus, in my view. But I don't talk about that in my Easter sermons. I don't like get into that debate, but sometimes I do feel like, well, I am painting a picture over here. And if you see something that you are always going to see in it, and it's fine, but I know what I paint. If you want to ask me what it means, what I think it means, I'll tell you, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah, because
I feel like that's maybe the way, right? To just be painting with integrity or whatever. I don't know.
Yeah.
So, well, gosh.
Well, and that like God doesn't seem to be all that interested in answering it either, you know? Like I think it was a senseless death and God didn't answer it. God just responded. Right. And I think that's super different. Like God wasn't like, yes, this all happened so that you could pay for your sin that you seem to be very worried about getting off the tally that I didn't literally even say anything about. But like, what is the deal with your bookkeeping? I don't know. I don't operate that way. And then like God instead just said, it is senseless. And my response to the senseless suffering of the world is still love. It's still connection. It's still life. Like it doesn't make it any less senseless. Do you know what I mean? Like we're still sad about it. It still shouldn't have happened. We can say that about so many things in the whole wide world, including things that happen to us and to people we love. And so for God to say, I'm not trying to like make light of that or even wrap it up in a bow for you. I'm just saying that's not the end of the story, you know, like that there's love. There's that Francis Spufford line, far more can be healed than you know. And it's like, yeah, you know, it's not far more can be fixed or undone. It's just healed. Like that seems to be true, right?
Oh, I love it. So what are you working on next, Danielle?
Well, as you know,
address to the Gospel Coalition. Tell us what you're up to.
Send them an advance copy. I am slowly writing some thoughts on living an original blessing that I hope will be a book. I am letting those come about organically, so there's not a huge timeline in it. And then I do hope to have a children's book in the works at some point. So stay tuned.
Oh my gosh. Well, I would love to see that. I know my readers would too. Any thoughts on kids? I mean, that's like such a huge, it's a way, I mean, obviously I'm biased, right? Because this is where I've tried to make my sort of professional home. But I think the way that we talk to kids about this, it's like, it could be undoing the whole thing. you know, it could
Yes.
be talking about the unraveling. And it's also part of the problem too. I say this all the time, but like in cooking, you know, you're reducing something down to its like essence. And that's what happens if we don't really have for ourselves, if we're not clear on what this means, then it's going to trickle down. That's why all the parents were like, no, it's a good thing. And you were like, say again, right? Like,
Right.
like
On what planet?
Like, this is like my friend and this is so sad. And it's like, no, it all works out in the end. Like, this is God's plan. Like,
you need him to for the Nancy Drew staying up late at night. It's like,
I didn't mean to. Okay.
I never asked him to die for me. That's a terrible thing to make me feel like it's my fault.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, it's like, I sometimes deal with dark humor by just making it funny, and it's not funny, but it also is darkly funny. It's like, okay, little baby. Oh my gosh. Anyway, so where can people find more about you? Are you DanielleShroyer.com?
Yes, it's DanielleShroyer.com.
And you have a blog called The Soul Ninja.
I have a blog called BeASoulNinja.com if you want to follow along. If you're into Buddhist, I call it Buddhish, as my Buddhist teacher calls
I mean, recently, yeah, that's the whole other conversation. We could talk about that. I think over the last, yeah, I don't know if you know my story. I just talked about this with Laura, but over like 3 years ago, I had an experience where, like, long story short, lots of trauma, people died, all sorts of things. And then I had insomnia for like 4 days, and my brain went into like true psychosis, like actual off.
Wow.
Seeing visions, seeing Jesus, had to be taken away in an ambulance, had to go to a psychiatric inpatient for a week. But I like, it sounds funny to say, but I'm like, I saw the whole thing, like the mystics when I'm like, I know those people now. I know what they saw. I know what they went through. I feel like it was such a blessing, actually. And where am I going with that? Oh, just in terms of in the whole sorting process, I had an amazing therapist that was open to, like, when I was like, we got to talk because this wasn't all bad. She was like, I know, you know, had her own sort of faith journey and a Hindu woman. And so through that, I have started to read a lot from a lot of different faith traditions, including Buddhism. And like, this can be our last thing. I know you got to go. Do you believe that you can be a Buddhist Christian?
Oh yeah, you totally can. Yeah,
right. Because it's a philosophy.
There's no God.
Right.
Yeah, there's no God.
It's like a philosophy on top of Christianity. And that's also started to explore a little bit. Right now, my kind of pet project is reading through the Stoic philosophers. And like, Laura just told me there's a book called Paul and the Stoics. I'm going to check that out. Anyway,
nice. There's a book called The Path that's really good too.
The Path?
Yeah. It's written by a professor who did a college class, and like everybody, it was like packed every semester because they just wanted to talk about it. And he was like, it's really hitting a nerve and it's really good.
Who's their author? I'll just
shoot.
It's fine. I'll just Google it.
No, I got it. It's right here. It is The Path, A New Way to Think About Everything by Michael Pewitt. Yeah, it's really good.
I feel like I've seen that cover.
Yeah, Harvard's most popular professor about the wisdom of ancient
that is quite a claim.
I know.
Harvard's most popular professor. Danielle, thank you so much. I love windy conversations. I was hoping the conversation would wind around, and it totally did. So yay. Thank you.
Yeah. So
we got to do one more. We got to do the thing. Original Blessing by Danielle Shroyer. Check it out. Buy it. Krista Tippett will call soon.
Right. Yeah. Okay. We'll see you, Traci.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.